In the year 2471, the human race stood at the precipice of extinction. The once proud colonies spread across the stars had dwindled, with most of them falling under the oppressive might of the Galactic Empire. What had begun as a bright future for humanity, a future filled with hope, ambition, and the promise of interstellar exploration, had quickly turned into a nightmare. Colonies were decimated, civilizations obliterated, and those who survived were left scattered in the dark corners of the galaxy, too weak and divided to mount any meaningful resistance. Among these few survivors was General Stephen, a man who had lived through the darkest moments of humanity's downfall and had managed to carve out a place for himself in the chaos. Born in the dying days of Earth, Stephen had seen the planet of his ancestors fall silent, the once vibrant cities reduced to ash and rubble. His early life was filled with constant change, a series of refugee camps, each one more grim than the last. He had learned early on what it meant to lose everything, to watch the people he loved disappear, one by one, until there was nothing left but a hollow echo of what once was. Stephen's parents were part of the last human settlement on Earth before the planet was abandoned. He had never known peace. His father, a former military officer, had instilled in him a sense of duty, teaching him to fight for what was right, to never back down, even in the face of overwhelming odds. But that resolve was tested time and time again as the Empire's ships blotted out the sun, casting a shadow of despair over the remnants of humanity. When Stephen was still young, his family was forced to flee to a colony on Mars, one of the few remaining places where humanity had any chance of survival. The Martian colony was small, a collection of makeshift structures and hastily built defenses, constantly under threat from Empire patrols. It was there that Stephen's life would take its first turn towards something more than survival. His father, once a commanding officer, had been conscripted into the military forces of the last human stronghold, the Federation of Human Resistance. The Federation had been a beacon of hope in a galaxy filled with enemies, but even it was crumbling under the weight of the Empire's relentless advance. At the age of 18, Stephen joined the Resistance, determined to make a difference in the fight for humanity's future. The Federation was already losing ground, and the battle was no longer about victory but survival. Stephen quickly rose through the ranks, his natural leadership abilities and sharp mind making him invaluable to the cause. But with every battle he fought, every victory he secured, Stephen watched as more and more of his comrades fell. The cost of war was evident in every scar and every life lost. Yet, for all the horrors he witnessed, Stephen refused to give up. He clung to the belief that humanity had something the Empire would never understand, the power of will. While the Empire relied on superior technology and vast fleets, Stephen knew that it was the human spirit, the refusal to surrender, that would ultimately tip the scales in their favor. It was during one of the darkest moments of the war that Stephen earned his title. The Federation had been cornered in the outer rim of the galaxy, their forces scattered and their supply lines cut off. Desperation had set in. Stephen, now a commander in the Federation's ranks, was tasked with leading a final stand, a mission so dangerous, so critical, that failure meant the end of humanity's last hope. The mission was simple: intercept and destroy a key supply convoy heading to the Empire's central warship, the Vanguard, a vessel of unimaginable power capable of crushing entire fleets with a single strike. The convoy was heavily guarded, and the odds of success were slim. But Stephen was unshaken. His mind was clear, and his resolve was unbreakable. The mission was a brutal one. The convoy was heavily fortified, and Empire ships seemed to be everywhere. But Stephen's tactical brilliance, honed through years of combat experience, allowed the resistance forces to gain the upper hand. With careful planning and precise strikes, Stephen's team managed to destroy the convoy, crippling the Empire's supply chain and delivering a blow to their war efforts. The victory, though hard-won, was a turning point. Stephen's reputation as a leader of unparalleled skill and courage spread throughout the resistance. He became known as the one person who could defy the odds, the one person who could give humanity a fighting chance. But with that victory came the realization that the Empire would not allow humanity to continue its fight without retaliation. The Vanguard, a colossal warship, was now preparing to launch an all-out assault on the Federation's last stronghold, a planet called Arcadia. The Federation was not prepared for the full might of the Empire's wrath. Their fleets were decimated, their forces shattered, and their resources stretched thin. There was no room for error. Arcadia was their final stand, the last hope of humanity. As Stephen stood before his troops, the weight of the moment pressed heavily on his shoulders. This would not be just another battle. This was the moment that would define humanity's future, the moment when they would either fall into oblivion or rise from the ashes to reclaim their place among the stars. Stephen knew that the fight ahead would be like none he had ever faced before, but he was ready. He could feel the pulse of his people, their hopes, their fears, their resolve, coursing through him. He would lead them to victory, or he would die trying. "Listen up," Stephen's voice rang out, cutting through the tension in the war room. "This is humanity's last chance. We're not just fighting for survival, we're fighting for everything that makes us human. Our courage, our creativity, our ability to stand against impossible odds. This fight is bigger than any of us. But I know we can win. We've faced worse, and we've never given up. We won't start now." The room fell silent, every soldier in that room hanging on his words. Stephen's gaze swept over his team, his friends, his comrades, the few who had survived alongside him. Their faces were grim, but there was a spark in their eyes. They were ready. "Prepare yourselves. Tomorrow, we fight. And tomorrow, we win." With those words, the Federation's final battle for humanity's future began. The silence of space was deafening as General Stephen's fleet drifted in the shadow of Arcadia, the last bastion of humanity. The Federation's final stronghold was not much to look at, just a small, war-torn planet surrounded by the debris of countless failed attempts at resistance. The Empire's fleet, a monstrous assembly of ships that stretched across the galaxy, was closing in. Stephen's forces, outnumbered and outgunned, could only hold the line for so long. His troops had been preparing for this moment for months, but even they could not ignore the sense of dread that had settled over them like a thick fog. Stephen stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Resolute, staring out at the looming stars. The vastness of space was both humbling and terrifying. Across the galaxy, the Empire was known for its unrelenting power, its fleets, its armies, its technology. But Stephen had seen firsthand that the Empire underestimated humanity's greatest weapon, the will to survive. The problem was that will alone would not be enough this time. The Vanguard, the Empire's flagship, was a force of nature in itself, a ship unlike anything humanity had ever faced. It could reduce entire fleets to ash with a single blast. And it was heading straight for Arcadia. "I never thought we'd be here," said Captain Rhea, Stephen's second in command, her voice tinged with a mix of exhaustion and determination. "Fighting for humanity's future, and the odds stacked so high against us." Stephen glanced at her, his eyes steady, unwavering. "We've faced worse. We'll find a way." He turned to face the holographic map that displayed the Empire's fleet. Hundreds of ships surrounded Arcadia like a pack of wolves circling their prey. Each one was a well-oiled machine of destruction, bristling with weapons and advanced technology. In the center, the Vanguard loomed, an enormous vessel of steel and might, its weaponry capable of obliterating anything in its path. It was surrounded by the Empire's elite forces, an armada led by the ruthless General Kalen, a commander known for his brutal tactics and complete lack of mercy. Stephen knew that Kalen would stop at nothing to wipe out the Federation once and for all. "Captain, initiate the battle plan," Stephen ordered. We don't have much time. Rhea nodded and turned to the tactical officers, who began implementing the first phase of the plan. The Federation's fleet, small and ragtag, would split into 3 groups. One would engage the outer rim of the Empire's forces, creating a diversion. The second group would attack the Empire's vulnerable flanks, hoping to exploit any weakness. The third group, Stephen's group, would target the Vanguard directly, using every scrap of firepower they had to disable the Empire's flagship. It was a suicide mission, but they had no choice. Stephen took his seat at the command center, his fingers hovering over the controls. His mind was racing, processing 1,000 possible outcomes. As the plan began to unfold, Stephen could feel the weight of leadership pressing on his shoulders. His troops were ready, but fear was beginning to creep in. The odds were insurmountable. The fight would be brutal. The cost, unimaginable. And yet, Stephen was resolute. He could not afford to let fear take hold. Not now, not when everything they had fought for was on the line. "Admiral, we've got incoming," one of the officers called out. "Empire fighters coming in fast." The alert sounded across the bridge as waves of enemy fighters streaked toward them. It was an ambush. Stephen had expected as much. The Vanguard wasn't just going to sit idle while they attacked. It was a living, breathing weapon, and its commanders were masters of strategy. The battle had begun. "Deploy the interceptors," Stephen barked. "All hands, brace for impact." The Federation's fleet sprang to life. Fighters and bombers shot off from the hangars, weaving and dodging through the chaos as explosions erupted around them. The first waves of enemy fighters descended, and the Federation fleet was immediately locked in a fierce dogfight. Stephen's flagship was surrounded by the roar of laser fire and the scream of missiles cutting through the void. The battle was in full swing. "We're holding them off, but not for long," Rhea shouted from her station. "The Vanguard is entering firing range." Stephen's heart skipped a beat. The Vanguard was here. Through the viewport, the massive ship grew larger. It seemed to take up the entire sky, its dark silhouette blocking out the stars. Stephen's hands gripped the armrests of his chair. The time for tactics was over. This was going to be a fight for survival. "Send the order to the other fleets," Stephen commanded, his voice cold. "We need to destroy their fighters before we can engage the Vanguard. All ships focus on the Empire's front line." The battle intensified as the Federation's forces fought tooth and nail to create a breach in the Empire's line. But as much as they tried to fight back, the Empire's superiority in numbers and firepower became apparent. Every time they thought they had the upper hand, the Empire seemed to counter with overwhelming force. Stephen could hear the static crackle of comms as his fleet took damage, as fighter pilots made their final desperate calls, as ships disintegrated into fireballs. Yet there was no retreat. No turning back. Then, with a thunderous crack, the Vanguard fired its primary weapon, its pulse cannon. The energy beam tore through the Federation's left flank, obliterating 3 capital ships in an instant. The shockwave rattled the Resolute, sending it off course, and Stephen was thrown forward, gripping the console to keep from being flung across the bridge. The sheer force of the weapon was enough to rattle even the most hardened of soldiers. The Federation's forces were reeling. "They've breached our shields. Hull integrity at 40%. The tactical officer shouted. Stephen's mind raced. The Vanguard was more powerful than he had anticipated. They had to act now, or Arcadia would fall. But he was not one to give up in the face of impossible odds. "Prepare for evasive maneuvers," he ordered. "We need to get closer. Our only chance is to disable their weapon systems." As the battle raged on, Stephen knew they were in the final stretch. His fleet was on the brink of collapse, but he refused to let it fall. Arcadia depended on them, and humanity's future depended on him. He wasn't going to let the Empire crush their spirit. They would find a way to win, even if it cost everything. The Resolute shook violently as another blast from the Vanguard's pulse cannon tore through the Federation's ranks, leaving a trail of destruction in its wake. The once proud fleet was now a scattered remnant of its former self, with debris and wreckage floating in every direction. The remaining ships, including Stephen's flagship, were crippled, their shields failing and their engines sputtering. The situation was dire. The Empire's forces were tightening their grip, and Arcadia, humanity's last hope, was all but doomed. Stephen's heart pounded in his chest, but his mind remained clear. He had known this day would come, but he wasn't prepared to give up, not when so many lives hung in the balance. Arcadia was all that remained of humanity's struggle. They had to win, no matter the cost. "Sir, our shields are failing." Captain Ray's voice rang out. "We can't take another hit like that." Stephen's jaw clenched. Their options were running out. He glanced at the screen, watching as the Vanguard slowly approached Arcadia, its massive form eclipsing the planet. It was now or never. The only way they could stop the Empire was by taking out the Vanguard's main weapon, a task that would be near impossible, but they had no choice. "Captain, prepare a boarding party," Stephen ordered, his voice unwavering. "We're going in." Ray's eyes widened in disbelief. "Boarding? But sir, that's a suicide mission. You can't." "We don't have a choice, Captain. We need to disable the pulse cannon, or we lose everything." Without waiting for a response, Stephen turned toward the comms officer. "Patch me through to the fleet." The officer nodded and connected the signal. Stephen's voice boomed across the fleet's remaining ships. "Listen up, this is General Stephen. We've got one shot at this. The Vanguard's weapon is our only obstacle. If we don't take it out now, we're all dead. I'm leading a boarding party to disable the pulse cannon. I need every available ship to cover us. This is our final chance." The comms crackled with the voices of his remaining commanders, their resolve matching his own. "Understood, General. We'll cover your entry point. All hands, prepare for the boarding assault." Stephen shouted as he turned to Rhea. "Get the team ready." Without hesitation, Rhea and the crew sprang into action. A squad of the Federation's best soldiers, trained in the art of infiltration and sabotage, was quickly assembled. Their mission was simple: board the Vanguard, fight their way to the core of the ship, and disable its pulse cannon. The journey would be perilous, but they had no other option. As the boarding pods were deployed, Stephen's heart skipped a beat. The Vanguard's defenses were formidable. No one had ever attempted a direct assault on the ship before. But he couldn't afford to think about failure. He knew the stakes. If they failed, humanity would be wiped out, and the galaxy would fall under the Empire's iron fist. The boarding pods slammed into the side of the Vanguard, and Stephen's team rushed out, weapons in hand. The ship was a labyrinth of dark corridors, the oppressive hum of Imperial machinery vibrating through the walls. The soldiers advanced cautiously, moving with precision through the dimly lit hallways. Every step was fraught with danger, every corner could hide an enemy soldier or a trap. The Imperial forces had already mobilized in response to their intrusion, and Stephen's team encountered heavy resistance almost immediately. Blaster fire erupted from both sides as Stephen and his team fought their way deeper into the heart of the ship. The sounds of explosions and the clang of metal on metal filled the air. Stephen led from the front, his military training and experience guiding his every move. Each battle was a small victory, but the true test lay ahead: the pulse cannon. After what seemed like an eternity of fighting, they finally reached the control room of the pulse cannon. The Empire's soldiers were waiting for them, heavily armed and ready to defend the weapon at all costs. But Stephen was determined. This was the moment that would define the future of humanity. "We can't stop now," Stephen yelled to his team. "Push forward." With a battle cry, the Federation soldiers launched themselves at the Imperial defenders, the clash of combat reaching a fever pitch. Stephen fought with relentless fury, his eyes locked on the massive cannon that stood before him, an instrument of mass destruction, capable of ending everything he had fought for. Finally, with a mighty effort, Stephen reached the central control panel of the pulse cannon. He slammed his fist down on the emergency override, activating the system's shutdown sequence. Sparks flew, and alarms blared as the cannon powered down, its deadly energy dissipating into nothingness. "We did it!" one of the soldiers shouted, relief flooding their voice. But Stephen knew this was not the end. They had succeeded in disabling the weapon, but the Vanguard itself was still a formidable threat. The Empire's forces were relentless, and Stephen's team was vastly outnumbered. The battle wasn't over. "We need to hold this position," Stephen barked, his voice a commanding presence. "We can't let them regain control." As the sounds of reinforcements echoed down the hallways, Stephen and his team prepared for the final stand. They had struck a blow to the Empire, but the cost would be steep. He could only hope that their sacrifice would be enough to give humanity a chance. The future of the galaxy rested in their hands. The air inside the Vanguard's control room was thick with smoke and the acrid scent of burning machinery. Stephen's team, bloodied and exhausted, stood their ground, holding off wave after wave of Imperial reinforcements. The battle had been brutal, but they had achieved the impossible. They had shut down the Vanguard's pulse cannon. The weapon that had threatened to wipe out humanity was now powerless, but the Empire's forces would not give up without a final, desperate attempt to regain control. Stephen, his uniform torn and stained with the marks of war, gritted his teeth as he held his position by the now deactivated cannon. The odds were still stacked against them. With the pulse cannon disabled, the Vanguard was vulnerable, but they were outnumbered, and every second they held out bought precious time for the rest of the Federation's fleet. "General," Ray's voice crackled through the comms. "We've breached the Vanguard's outer shields. We're going to give you an opening. But you need to hold on. We won't be able to last much longer." Stephen's heart pounded in his chest. His team was exhausted, their energy nearly spent, but he could not allow them to falter now. Humanity's future depended on this final push. He turned to his team, determination blazing in his eyes. "We're not backing down," he said, his voice steady and resolute. "We fight until the end." The battle outside raged on, the Federation's remaining ships battling tooth and nail against the Empire's overwhelming forces. Stephen's squad fought fiercely, their weapons blazing as they held the line, pushing back the Empire's soldiers inch by inch. But Stephen knew they couldn't win this through sheer force alone. They needed one final, decisive blow. Minutes felt like hours as the battle continued, but at last, a breakthrough came. A signal from the Federation's fleet confirmed that the last of the Vanguard's defenses had been breached. The remaining Imperial ships had begun to retreat, their commanders realizing that the tide of war had shifted. The Empire's grip on the galaxy was weakening. "We've done it," Ray's voice rang out, a mix of relief and disbelief. "The Empire is pulling back. The Vanguard is crippled, and their fleet is retreating." Stephen let out a long breath, his shoulders sagging with the weight of exhaustion. The battle was over. The Federation had won. Humanity had won. Against all odds, they had done the impossible. Stephen's heart swelled with pride for his comrades and for the people of Arcadia, whose sacrifices had made this victory possible. As the last of the Empire's ships disappeared into the void, the stars seemed to shine a little brighter, as though the universe itself recognized the significance of the moment. Stephen looked out over the battlefield, the remnants of the war fading into the distance, and allowed himself a brief moment of quiet reflection. The fight had cost them dearly, but humanity had proved something that would echo through the ages: the power of resolve, the strength of will, and the unyielding spirit of those who refused to give up. The war was not over, but this battle would be remembered for generations to come as the moment humanity rose from the ashes and secured its place in the galaxy once more. As Stephen stood among the wreckage, he knew that their victory would inspire future generations to never surrender, no matter the odds. The spirit of humanity, its greatest weapon, had triumphed. Humanity lives, Stephen whispered to himself, watching the stars burn bright once more.